Hello, my name is Kevin Thompson. I'm from DePaul University. I'll be reading a paper here in just a moment for the workshop, but I just wanted to begin by thanking the organizers for their efforts to move this online. I know that was very challenging, so I appreciate their work. I also appreciate the invitation to be a participant in this workshop. I'm very much looking forward to it. So I also want to say to my fellow workshop participants, I'm very excited to learn from your contributions, and I hope what I have here for you today is also worth of your time and attention. So the title of my paper is Contra Teleology, Hegel on Subjective and Objective Purpose. It's about a 35-minute long paper, so you can be settle in and realize how long we're going to be taking here. So Contra Teleology, Hegel on Subjective and Objective Purpose. Hegel's philosophy is not teleological. This admittedly provocative claim clearly cuts against the grain of various strands of interpretation of Hegel's thought. But it is, I shall argue, nonetheless true. Of course, much depends here on exactly what is meant by teleology and teleological. As I shall use the terms, a philosophy is teleological whenever it takes the basic nature of the world itself, or any account of that world, to be ultimately defined by final causality. That is to say, by a process that unfolds as the actualization of a final cause, a template or form, born potentially, where that form predetermines and guides its own course of development towards its ultimate destiny. The end is always already there, in the beginning, guiding the process towards its destination. Now, this broadly Aristotelian interpretation has stood as the dominant way of understanding Hegel's views about not only metaphysics, of course, but about history, nature, art, even the nature of self-consciousness and spirit itself. And it is buttressed, we must quickly acknowledge, by Hegel's own seeming endorsement of final causes in the remark he introduced to paragraph 204, the opening of the account of teleology in the science of logic, in the second edition of the Encyclopedia, the 1827 edition, as well as his apparent widespread usage of organic metaphors and analogies throughout his system. So, to give but one example, a famous one, quote, just as the seed bears within itself the whole nature of the tree, even the taste and forms of its fruits, so also do the first traces of spirit contain virtually the whole of history, unquote. And yet, despite the allure of this interpretation, I believe it is profoundly mistaken. And I contend that perhaps paradoxically, the account of teleology in the science of logic demonstrates precisely this point. The argument of what follows, stated broadly, is that the teleological interpretation of Hegel's philosophy fails because it is predicated upon an insufficiently systematic concept of teleology. It conceives the end of a process as always already being contained, potentially or virtually, in its beginning. And yet, on Hegel's analysis, this is simply not what teleology in its extrinsic or its intrinsic form actually is. The systematic account of teleology is, at its core, a crucial stage in the elaboration, what Hegel calls the concept, or more properly, what he terms the movement of the concept. His analysis shows that the movement of the concept is properly understood as a process of self-differentiation, where the imminent and necessary unfolding of determinate negation itself, and itself alone, engenders the development without possessing or relating itself to any antecedent content, a process that Hegel calls logical life. My contention is that this austere thesis, rather than any form of final causality, is, as Hegel puts it, the truth of teleology, the movement of the concept, and that this undermines the claim that Hegel's philosophy is teleological in the conventional sense. Now, of the various questions that are standardly posed about teleology, two issues will organize our discussions in what follows. First, its status, that is, whether it's extrinsic or intrinsic, and its nature, so the nature of teleology, whether it is rooted in final causation or some other driving force. Both of these issues revolve around the distinction Hegel draws between extrinsic and intrinsic purpose, what he calls subjective and objective forms of purpose. Accordingly, the essay is divided into four parts. The first outlines the basic terms of what Hegel means by objectivity in the science of logic, as this category sets the specific parameters for Hegel's account of teleology. The second part then turns to an analysis of the definition and argument for subjective or extrinsic purpose, focusing in particular on the way in which this conception of purpose follows from the account of what Hegel calls chemism, The third part then examines the argumentation that leads from subjective purpose to intrinsic or objective purpose. This, what Hegel calls logical life. The status of purposiveness will be the primary concern throughout these first sections. But this will lead us in the conclusion, so the fourth part, to Hegel's account of the nature of teleology, and thus to the issue at hand. Is Hegel's philosophy a form of teleology in the standard sense? So section 1. The chapter on teleology is the culmination of the second section in the doctrine of the concept, entitled Objectivity in the Science of Logic and Object in the Encyclopedia. Now, as we all are no doubt aware, the logic is divided into 3 books, being essence, concept, with the first 2 being, in essence, comprising what Hegel calls the objective logic, and the third, so concept, alone being the subjective logic. So what is an account of something called object or objectivity doing in the subjective logic? Hegel clearly acknowledges the strangeness, he calls it even the oddity of this section, and its placement in this part of the logic. Nonetheless, though, the basic line of argument in the subjective logic does serve to clarify its status there. The outline of the argument can be stated very broadly as showing that the structure of the movement of the concept is fundamentally inferential. And when the complete, comprehensive, determinate structure of this process, evident in the form of the disjunctive syllogism, is laid out, then what is also grasped is nothing other than that the very movement of actuality itself is inferential. Because that syllogistic form, the disjunctive syllogistic form, holds that the middle term for the disjunctive syllogism is universality, is what generates its own major and minor terms, so both the particular and the individual. The disjunctive syllogism form shows that universality, its most fundamental truth, neither inheres as a particular feature in individuals, nor are individuals subsumed as particular instances of universality. Rather, universality itself differentiates itself into particular kinds, and these are what constitutes individuals. The activity of disjunctive inferring is not then solely, nor even fundamentally for Hegel, a process of subjective reflection. It is instead itself inherently objective. Or better, the structure of the disjunctive syllogism is the structure of actuality itself. Disjuncting, the structure of the process of self-differentiation, just is objectivity. This takes us to Hegel's core claim about this section, the section on objectivity. What is at stake in the analysis is nothing less than to show that the movement of the concept is not simply submerged in objectivity, wholly one with objectivity, as it appears at least initially to be, but precisely in objectivity, even through objectivity, to show that the concept gives itself its own end, that it is, as Hegel argues, free. Hegel writes, speaking of the section on objectivity and laying out the plan for the subjective logic as a whole, quote, "One with the matter, it," the concept, is submerged into it. Its differences are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself again the inner. As the soul of objective existence, it must give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as formal concept. And so in the form of the free, which in objectivity it did not yet have, it opposes itself to objectivity, and therein, by opposing itself to objectivity, and therein makes identity with it, which as objective concept it has in and for itself, into a posited identity, unquote. That's from page 30 of the critical edition of Hegel's Science of Logic. This passage provides the proof structure of the argument that is set forth in Objectivity. As tortuous as that passage is, I think it does lay out a fairly clear proof structure that governs the entire analysis or account in Objectivity. The deduction is comprised of 3 distinct moments, a beginning, a conclusion, and then he lays out the core argument. So the beginning of that argument is, as identical with objectivity, the concept is initially submerged, constricted, and thus unfree in it. It's unfree in objectivity. This is what he means when he says, its differences, the concept's differences, are objective determinations of existence in which it is itself again the inner, it's buried, submerged within it. Then he gives you the conclusion. The freedom of the concept, which had been shown to define the concept in subjectivity, must necessarily be restored to it in objectivity. It must be shown to be what it is in objectivity as well. That's what he means by the line, it must give itself the form of subjectivity that it immediately had as formal concept. Then he lays out at the end of that passage the core argument of objectivity itself, in very condensed, obviously, in compressed form. But he writes, What he says there is that the process of proving the concept is free in and through objectivity is a matter of the concept being shown not just to emerge as distinct from objectivity, but to be that which, the concept, to be that which engenders or posits objectivity. So that's what he means by the line. And so in the form of the free, with which in objectivity did not yet have, it, that is the concept, opposes itself to objectivity and therein makes identity with it, which as an objective concept it has in and for itself, into a posited identity. The section thus seeks to establish, the section on objectivity, thus seeks to establish that the concept is not just the inner, immediate, submerged soul of objectivity, but its generative source, that it posits objectivity as its own, which is to say that the concept is self-differentiating and self-determining in and through objectivity. The section does this by employing a distinction to which Hegel alludes in this passage, what he calls, later in the introduction to the section itself, the double meaning of objectivity. So this is a quote from 131 in the critical edition. Objectivity as standing opposed to the self-subsistent concept, yet also existing in and for itself. This is the distinction between objectivity as an immediate existence, as the manifold world of objects set over against the concept, and objectivity is that which is in and for itself, as that which is rational and necessary, unrestricted, and without opposition. Hegel clearly tells us that objectivity as in and for itself is what is fundamentally at stake or at play in the first two chapters of the section, in the accounts of mechanism and chemism, while objectivity as immediate existence is what is operative in the final chapter, the chapter on teleology. He tells us this on 131 through 132 in the critical edition again. So the argument of this section is thus that objectivity as in and for itself is articulated fundamentally by the process set forth initially in mechanism and developed further in chemism, but that this same process has its truth in teleology, which takes objectivity as the immediate existence in which extrinsic purpose, the concept, is realized. The argument for the concept being free in and through objectivity, as a result, turns on the claim that by virtue of its own imminent and necessary unfolding, the concept is shown to oppose itself to objectivity, rendering objectivity thereby no longer in and for itself, but immediate existence. And precisely by virtue of that moment, the concept makes identity with objectivity not something immediate, something in which it is simply submerged, but something that the concept itself produces, that it posits. This pivot point in the argument begins with the transition from chemism to teleology, which is the moment where subjective purpose conceptually emerges. And it concludes with the transition from teleology to life, where objective purpose is deduced. So the first transition, the one from chemism to teleology, will be the concern of the next section of this paper, and the second one, the one that moves from teleology to life, will be the concern of the following section after that. So section 2. The chapter on chemism in the Science of Logic, despite being one of the shortest chapters in the text, is notoriously among the most difficult and challenging in what is admittedly an immensely difficult and challenging work. Accordingly, we will not be able here to trace the various subtleties and complexities of its analyses or of its line of argument. As our concern is with the transition from it to the final chapter on teleology, we will concentrate on that decisive moment. To do so, let us briefly review the core claims of the analysis up to this point. So this is an extremely compressed account of chemism up to the point of its transition into teleology. So objects insofar as they are chemical are, Hegel contends, inherently contradictory. So objects insofar as they're chemical are inherently contradictory. They are individual objects, and as such universal self-subsistent totalities, but they are also, and at the same time, particularizations of the genus that they share with all other objects insofar as they are chemical, the genus chemical objects. As inherently contradictory, each and every object qua chemical is thus defined by a striving to overcome its one-sidedness, that is, its individuality over against the universality of the shared genus, and it's striving to establish the objectivity of the concept that it bears within itself. By virtue of this striving, each object possesses an affinity for all the other objects, all other chemically determined objects. And this affinity serves to draw them all together. Affinity thus forms what Hegel calls an external community. Bound in this extrinsic element, objects qua chemical, on the one hand, communicate with one another in a tranquil coming together. And on the other hand, the real differences between objects are dissolved, reduced to tranquil neutrality. It is in this way, then, that the chemical process of striving, at least initially, is extinguished, and the contradiction between the concept and its reality is resolved. But the universality that is the genus here, and thus the driving force of the chemical process, is not reducible to the neutralized product that it has thereby produced. Quote, this is on page 150, it is still present but has stepped outside it, the concept, this process. It is still present but has stepped outside the neutral object. Unquote. The negative unity of this external community, precisely due to its externality, is in tension with its own abstractness. And as a result, because this negative unity necessarily strives to realize itself concretely in a content that is adequate to itself as a process, and thus not as a resultant neutral product, the negative unity necessarily disrupts the tranquil neutrality of the external community. The negative unity thus actually proves to be the middle term, or objective universality of the disjunctive syllogism that breaks up into, is Hegel's term for it, and thereby joins together the extremes of self-subsistent individuality and these individuals' animating principle, their self-subsisting universality, the catalyst that holds them apart. The chemical process is thus the form of disjunctive syllogism existing in and for itself. The objective universality as the middle term differentiates itself into the extremes of individuality and the particularity of formal or abstract, here negative, universality, and thereby makes possible the relation of one to the other. The chemical process therefore posits the presupposition of indifferent objects with which the account of chemism actually began. They are nothing other than the bases produced by the disruption that is objective universality itself. And this brings us to the transition from chemism to teleology. Because with the conceptual unfolding of the chemical process into its own as disjunctive syllogism, we have the emergence of the concept from out of its submergence in objectivity, in and for itself, and the site where objectivity becomes now for the concept an immediately existing objectivity. Quote, this is page 152 of the critical edition. Chemism is itself the first negation of the indifferent objectivity and of the externality of determinateness. It is still burdened, therefore, by the immediate self-subsistence of the object and with externality. Consequently, it is not yet for itself that totality of self-determination that proceeds from it in which it is rather sublated. Unquote. The chemical process is thus the objective universal that particularizes itself into the extremes of singular objects and particularity, and it is at once then a union and a separation, the mediating middle term. It follows from this, Hegel contends, that the concept is no longer conditioned by objectivity, and as such the concept qua chemical process is determined precisely as purpose. Quote, this is page 153. The concept that has herewith sublated The concept that has herewith sublated as external all the moments of its objective existence and has posited them in its simple unity is thereby completely liberated, freed from the objective externality to which it relates only as an unessential reality. This objective free concept is purpose, Zweck. As Hegel notes, the transition here revolves around the claim that in chemism, the concept has sublated the various moments of its immediate objectivity, and the concept is thereby objectively free because it now, rather than objective existence, conditions itself. Right? The concept conditions itself rather than being submerged in objectivity, it conditions itself rather than objectivity being its condition. But exactly how has this been demonstrated? Hegel claims that the externality defined by the contradiction between the concept in itself and its realization for itself, namely the striving that all objects qua chemical possess, is sublated because the concept has been shown to inhere in each and every object qua chemical. The externality of the negative unity, neutrality as dissolved product, is sublated because all objects qua chemical are subsumed under the neutral element in which they all stand together as one community of objects. And finally, the externality of the entire abstract external immediacy is sublated because the negative unity was shown to be an objective universality that itself constitutes, by virtue of self-differentiation, both the objects and the element, and thereby joins them to one another. In this sense, then, all the presuppositions of chemism, all of what Hegel calls in the passage the moments of its objective existence, have been shown to be posited by the concept, by the chemical process itself. And with this, the concept as this process has indeed liberated itself from objective externality. Objectivity in and for itself, the sense of objectivity that has defined mechanism and chemism, becomes here then external immediacy. And the concept thus now stands over against, that is extrinsic to, objectivity as objectivity's now defining purpose. But if we grant this admittedly intricate argument, and it is intricate, dense, we are still left to wonder in what sense is the concept here distinctly purposive. Is this merely Hegel's stipulative definition? Hegel contends that since the concept is no longer buried within objectivity, the concept stands over against objectivity, and now engages with objectivity for its own sake. Which is to say, as sublated in all its moments, objectivity now exists as immediate existence wholly for the sake of the concept's determination. The relationship of concept to objectivity is thus certainly purposive, but the argument thus far establishes only an extrinsic form of purposiveness, a type of instrumental relationship between the concept and objectivity. Now, with this account of the conceptual emergence of subjective purpose in place, we can turn to the second moment, the deduction of objective purpose, that is logical life. So here's section 3. Hegel's treatment of the subjective or extrinsic form of purposiveness argues really for one singular claim. That claim is this: subjective purposiveness is spuriously infinite. It's a relationship of instrumentality, expediency, even violence or force, Gewalt, because the purpose always stands separate from the means for its realization, immediate existence, and as such, it must impose itself, force itself upon it. This relationship of subjective purpose to means is a relationship of individuality to particularity that always requires a further intermediary. In this relation, because particularity is the mediating term of the relation, requires yet another intermediary as well, and so on and so forth. Hegel thus concludes, quote, this is from 169 in the critical edition, the result now is that external purposiveness, which only has at first the form of teleology, only goes so far as to be a means, not to be an objective purpose, because subjective purpose remains an external subjective determination, or insofar as purpose is active and attains completion, albeit only in a means, it is still bound up immediately with objectivity. It is sunk into it. Purpose is itself an object, and one may say it does not attain to or reach the means because its realization is required before that realization could be brought about through a means. Unquote. Yet Hegel immediately and paradoxically claims that this same result, the one he's just outlined, that the extrinsicality of subjective purpose condemns it to being a form of spurious infinity. He says that that same result is, quote, in fact not only an external purpose relation, but the truth of such a relation, inner purpose relation, and an objective purpose, unquote. Again, that's 169. But how exactly does subjective purpose follow eminently and necessarily for Hegel as the truth of subjective purpose, that is, as what subjective purpose truly is? Hegel identifies, I think, the nerve of the argument in question in the following passage. This is again still 169. The self-subsistent externality of the object over against the object. Excuse me, let me say that again. The self-subsistent externality of the object over against the concept, which purpose presupposes, is posited in this presupposition as an unessential shine, and also as already sublated in and for itself. The activity of the purpose is, therefore, properly only the presentation of the shine and the sublation of it. Unquote. Now, to say that the object or objectivity in its self-subsistence, that is, in its being immediate over against the concept, is a reflective shine, is just to say that it is posited by purpose itself as its product. As a result, immediate existence does not actually stand over against, distinct from, the purpose. Rather, it is itself the realization. Objectivity is itself the realization of the purpose. The purpose is thus inherently objective, rather than merely subjective. The key to the argument is thus to show that the immediate existence upon which subjective purpose must impose itself is actually not extrinsic to purpose at all, but its very own, purpose's very own product. Or put otherwise, that objective purpose is but the sublation of objectivity of itself by itself. Hegel proceeds to lay out an analysis that establishes this very point. He begins by recalling that objectivity, now as immediate existence standing over against extrinsic purpose, has already been shown, when it was objective in the sense of being in and for itself, to be susceptible to being a means, what Hegel called its being, quote, entirely penetrable by purpose, unquote. That's on 164. But it is susceptible or available to extrinsic purpose in this way precisely because it proved to be, in the accounts of mechanism, and most especially as we have seen in chemism, because objectivity proved to be the product of the process that ultimately showed itself to be purpose. Stated formally, Hegel's argument is that the relation of individual purpose to universal realization in objectivity, that through its imposition on the particular means defines extrinsic teleology, is made possible by the objective universality of the concept that differentiates itself into these two extremes. Universality differentiating itself in individuality and particularity. Hegel thus notes, quote, as a result, determination of the object as a means is an entirely immediate one. It's not imposed upon, it's entirely immediate one. That's on page 170. And if objectivity is itself already generated by the movement of the concept, then purpose does not need to be imposed extrinsically, that is, instrumentally or violently or forcefully. It doesn't need to be imposed extrinsically upon it, as the purpose forms objectivity itself. And it follows from this, the purpose is not merely subjective or formal at all. Hegel thus concludes, quote, there is no need, therefore, for the subjective purpose to exercise any violence or reinforcement against it, against objectivity, other than reinforcement of itself, to make the object into a means. The resolution, the resolve, this determination of itself, is the only posited externality of the object, which is therein immediately subjected to purpose, and has no other determination as against it than that of the nothingness of the being in and for itself, unquote, page 170. The conceptual unfolding of teleology therefore shows that the truth of subjective purpose is the differentiated unity of purpose and objectivity, wherein the purpose produces objectivity immanently and as its own shine. Which is to say, the truth of subjective purpose is objective purpose, and the concept therein now conditions itself, determines itself, and thereby is genuinely free. What then is objective purpose? Hegel elaborates this concept through the category of logical life. Now, we cannot here obviously explore all the details of this extremely important notion, but we can consider what Hegel contends is the minimal determination of the distinctly logical, as opposed to the natural or spiritual conception of life. Quote, this is on page 181. It is impulse, Trieb, or precisely the specific impulse of particular difference, and no less essentially the one and universal impulse of the specific that leads its particularization back to unity and holds it therein. Only as this negative unity of its objectivity and particularization is life self-relating, life that exists for itself, a soul, unquote. Objective purpose as the logical idea of life is nothing other than objective universality. The impulse, the drive to differentiate, to particularize, to negate, where this impulse is neither conditioned by external nature, nor is an instrument or vehicle or ideality for something else's use. Instead, the impulse is itself what engenders its own conditions. It is what moves itself solely of itself. Logical life, the concept as objective purpose, as idea, just is determinate negation. Nothing more, but nothing less. It is the process of self-referential negation that engenders an affirmative result. In this sense, logical life is an operation that relates to itself only in and through its becoming other. It is essentially differing itself, and in this sense properly deemed by its Selbstsein in einem anderen. Now, with this exegesis of Hegel's systematic accounts of subjective and objective purpose in hand, I want to return to our broader question about the teleological nature of Hegel's philosophy and consider briefly here in the conclusion the import of these categories and the argumentation underlying them for this pivotal issue. So section 4, conclusion. What then does Hegel's systematic treatment, which we've just examined, show us about the pervasive view that his philosophy is teleological? That the process at its very core, the movement of the concept, has its end always already there in its beginning, that the movement of the concept is nothing other than a distinctly, perhaps post-critical rehabilitation of final causality. Let me begin by noting what I take to be some fairly non-controversial points, although we can certainly have discussions of these as well. First, whether subjective or objective, purpose for Hegel is not, at least at this most fundamental level, an end or goal set by or being pursued by a will or any form of consciousness or thought. Purpose here is non-intentional. Second, purpose, again, whether subjective or objective, is not a potentiality that is actualized. Purpose is not antecedent in any sense to objectivity. And third, purpose is not a cause of an effect. It is not, again at the most fundamental level, a causal power that stands in reciprocal relation with objectivity. Purpose for Hegel is the concept that is no longer submerged in objectivity in and for itself. Initially, this means, as we've seen, that it is the concept standing over against objectivity as immediate existence, and as such that it is a distinctly extrinsic or subjective form of purpose, one that confronts objects, whether in terms of their mechanical or chemical determinations, and determines them, even violently imposing itself on them, so as to get them to accord with, bring them into accordance with itself. In this extrinsic sense, Hegel's account of teleology comes perhaps closest to the rudiments of the conventional model, where the core idea, at least, is instrumentality or expediency, that some things exist or happen for the sake of other things. But even here, Hegel's account shows that purpose, because it is the concept, necessarily is a process rather than a form or a template, and a process that must particularize, differentiate, disjunct itself, and by that be self-determining, which is to say, free. Purpose is therefore distinctly self-realizing. It is an end that is not predicated on some antecedent conditions. It is not moved to realize itself by something else. Rather, it moves itself, and it does so simply and solely because that's what it inherently is, the generative process of self-differentiation that is the realization of itself solely by virtue of itself, genuine and complete self-determination. The account of objective purpose builds on this point by showing that the only way in which objectivity can be susceptible or amenable to determination by subjective purpose is if objectivity itself just is the product, the unessential shine, of the self-differentiation of the concept. Since this is precisely what is established in the accounts of mechanism and chemism, then the truth of subjective purpose, the truth of teleology, proves to be objective purpose, logical life. But this means that logical life is, again, as we have seen, nothing other than the specific impulse of particular difference, and no less essentially the one and universal impulse of the specific that leads its particularization back to unity and holds it therein, as Hegel says. Which is to say, it is the process of determinate negation, whereby self-relation is generated through self-differentiation. This distinctive conception of negation creates solely by negating itself. As such, it too does not admit of being understood as a typical abstract form or template bearing potentially the ultimate destiny towards which it guides its actualization. Rather, it is a structured process that immanently engenders objectivity in and through becoming other. But, and this is really the pivotal point, Hegel's systematic account of objective purpose shows that this activity or process does not bear within itself the seeds of the destination towards which it is headed. It is only the impulse or drive to self-negation, self-particularization, where that drive or impulse is wholly self-referential, and thus contains no antecedents, whether potential or actual. It is thus right to say, then, that for Hegel, the concept is a process that is not only not predetermined, but an activity without a destiny, without an end in view, that the for itself is not necessarily in the in itself. That, in fact, and contrary to what the auditor's reports tell us, the seed does not bear within itself the whole nature of the tree, even the taste and forms of its fruits, and neither do the first traces of spirit contain virtually the whole of history. What is necessary about the concept is simply and solely becoming other, differentiation, where there is no intact identity, no intact universality, no intact essence that precedes this process. The seed is nothing but the immediacy, whose very immediate insufficiency, whose very imminent insufficiency, is what propels it to become other than itself, to become the determinations that together, perhaps, comprise a tree. The deduction of subjective purpose and objective purpose thus establishes, I believe, that the movement of the concept, the activity Hegel calls logical life, is properly a process where the imminent and necessary unfolding of autonomous negation itself, and itself alone, engenders the development. Accordingly, this admittedly rather austere thesis, rather than any form of final causality, is the truth of teleology, and as such, the claim that Hegel's philosophy is teleological is undermined by that philosophical project's own genuinely systematic account of teleology. Thank you very much.